It is often said that the difference between life and death in war is measured in miles or minutes. In the grand strategy of generals, looking down at maps spread across massive oak tables, the units of measurement are divisions, army groups, and supply lines stretching across continents. But for the men inside the machines, for the individuals strapped into the freezing aluminum tubes cruising at 25,000 feet above enemy territory, the margin of survival is much, much smaller. It is not measured in miles. It is not even measured in seconds. Sometimes, the difference between coming home to a warm bunk or disappearing into a freezing fog over Europe comes down to a fraction of an inch. This is the story of that fraction of an inch. It is the story of a machine that was hated before it was loved, a weapon that was flawed before it was famous, and a man who looked at a factory blueprint, realized the engineers were wrong, and decided to fix it himself. It is a story about the B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber that was produced in greater numbers than any other American military aircraft in history, yet carried a dark reputation among the crews who flew it. They called it the Flying Coffin. They called it the Widow Maker. And for the gunners stationed in the tail of the aircraft, they called it a death trap. But this is also the story of Master Sergeant Thomas MacDonald, a man they called Mac, who looked at that death trap and saw something else. He saw a mechanical puzzle. He saw a system that was failing his friends. And on a freezing night in January 1944, armed with nothing but a file, a wrench, and a piece of scrap metal scavenged from the wreckage of the enemy, he performed an illegal surgery on the heart of a bomber that would change the course of the air war. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't file a report. He simply solved the problem. To understand why a piece of scrap metal the size of a playing card could save hundreds of lives, we first have to understand the beast itself. The B-24 Liberator was a marvel of mass production. It was faster than the B-17 Flying Fortress, it could carry a heavier bomb load, and it had a longer range. On paper, it was the superior bomber. It was the plane that was supposed to crush the industrial heart of Germany. It had a unique Davis wing design, a high aspect ratio wing that provided efficient cruising speeds and long range. It was an ugly, slab-sided aircraft, often compared to a flying boxcar, but it was packed with heavy machine guns. From the nose to the tail, the B-24 was bristling with 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. These were weapons capable of tearing a fighter plane apart. The theory was simple: if you put enough heavy bombers in a tight formation, and you put enough heavy guns on each bomber, the combined firepower would create an impenetrable wall of lead. Any enemy fighter foolish enough to approach the formation would be swatted out of the sky. That was the theory. The reality, as the crews of the 44th Bomb Group discovered in the winter of 1943 and 1944, was horrifyingly different. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was not foolish. They were experienced, they were adaptable, and they were flying machines like the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt Bf 109. These were fast, agile predators. And the German pilots had discovered a secret. They had found the blind spot. They had found the Achilles heel of the B-24. The weakness was in the tail. Technically, the B-24 had a powered tail turret. It was a glass and aluminum bubble at the very rear of the plane, occupied by a lone gunner who sat exposed to the freezing slipstream, guarding the rear of the formation. It was supposed to be a position of strength. But in practice, it was the most dangerous seat in the war. The German pilots realized that if they attacked from the front, the closing speeds were too high, nearly 600 miles per hour combined, giving them only a split second to fire. If they attacked from the side, they were exposing themselves to the massive waist guns of the bomber formation. But if they came from behind, dead astern, they could match the speed of the bomber. They could settle in, stabilize their aircraft, and pour cannon fire into the B-24's engines and fuselage. The only thing standing between a German fighter and the destruction of a B-24 was that tail gunner. And that was where the problem lay. The men of the 44th Bomb Group, known as the Flying Eight Balls, were losing planes at an unsustainable rate. In just 6 weeks, 37 Liberators had gone down. Hundreds of men were missing or confirmed captured. And the survivors all told the same story. They talked about the fighters coming in from the 6 o'clock position. They talked about seeing the enemy, tracking them, and then failing. The official reports blamed the gunners. The brass at headquarters said the men were panicking. They said the gunners weren't leading the targets correctly. They said it was a training issue. They sent memos demanding more target practice. They sent officers to lecture the exhausted crews on the geometry of aerial deflection shooting. But Master Sergeant Thomas MacDonald wasn't an officer. He wasn't a pilot. He was an armorer. His office was the freezing tarmac of an airbase in England. His hands were permanently stained with grease and hydraulic fluid. He didn't look at charts. He looked at the machines. And he listened to the men. MacDonald was a career mechanic, the kind of man who could listen to an engine idle and tell you which cylinder was running lean. He knew the internal workings of the Browning machine gun better than the men who designed it. And he knew the gunners. He drank coffee with them in the mess hall before missions, and he waited on the flight line to count the planes coming back. Lately, the counting had been the hardest part of his day. He kept hearing the same complaint from the tail gunners who made it back. They would sit on the crates of ammunition, shaking with adrenaline and nicotine, and tell him that the turret felt mushy. They described it as trying to steer a car with a flat tire. They said they would see the German fighter, they would move the control stick to track it, and for a heartbeat, a terrifying, silent heartbeat, nothing would happen. The turret wouldn't move. By the time the hydraulics caught up and the guns swung around, the fighter had already fired and peeled away. MacDonald knew that a machine does not panic. A machine does not get scared. If 100 different men were reporting the same sluggish behavior in the turret, it wasn't a psychological problem. It was a mechanical one. The B-24's tail turret was a complex piece of engineering. It was powered by a hydraulic system. When the gunner moved his control handles, he wasn't physically moving the guns. The guns were too heavy, and the wind resistance at 200 miles per hour was too great for human muscle. Instead, the control handles opened valves. These valves allowed high-pressure hydraulic fluid to flow into cylinders, and the pressure of the fluid moved the turret. It was a servo-assisted system, designed to make the heavy guns feel light and responsive. MacDonald began spending his nights inside the tail turrets of grounded bombers. He would have a fellow mechanic stand outside and signal, and he would snap the controls, watching the mechanism. He traced the lines. He checked the pressure gauges. He dismantled the control box and put it back together. Everything was within factory specifications. The fluid was clean. The pumps were strong. The valves were seating correctly. According to the manual, the turret was perfect. But the manual was written in a warm office in San Diego, California. It was not written in the sub-zero temperatures of the European stratosphere. MacDonald found the flaw not in the major components, but in the linkage. Between the gunner's hand grip and the hydraulic valve that actually released the fluid, there was a series of metal rods and pivots. It was a mechanical chain. And like any chain, it had slack. When the gunner moved the handle, the first fraction of movement didn't actually open the valve. It just took up the slack in the linkage. It was a tiny amount of play. About 1/4 of an inch. In a factory test, 1/4 of an inch of play is nothing. It's a tolerance. It allows for thermal expansion, it prevents the system from being too twitchy. But MacDonald realized that this 1/4 inch was the killer. When a German Focke-Wulf 190 is closing in at 400 miles per hour, it covers nearly 600 feet every second. If the gunner moves his stick and there's a delay of just 0.2 of a second while the mechanical slack is taken up, the enemy fighter has moved over 100 feet. The gunner aims where the fighter is. He moves the stick. The turret delays. By the time the guns fire, the fighter is gone. The bullets streak harmlessly through empty air. The German pilot sees the tracers miss, corrects his aim, and destroys the bomber. That 1/4 inch of slack was a time delay. It was a buffer zone where American airmen were dying. MacDonald took his findings to the engineering officer. He explained the linkage play. He explained the delay. He drew diagrams on the back of a requisition form. showing how the slack translated to missed shots at combat ranges. The response was immediate and disheartening. He was told that the turrets were built to consolidated aircraft specifications. He was told that the play in the controls was a safety feature to prevent accidental firing or oversensitive corrections. He was reminded sternly that he was an armorer, not an aeronautical engineer. Any modification to the hydraulic control system was strictly prohibited. It would void the warranty, a ridiculous concept in war, but a powerful one in bureaucracy, and more importantly, it was considered a safety violation. If he tampered with the controls and a turret malfunctioned, he would be court-martialed. "The system works as designed, Sergeant," the officer had said, dismissing him. "The problem is the gunners. They need to lead the target more." MacDonald walked out of that office with a knot in his stomach. He knew the officer was wrong. He knew it with the certainty of a man who works with his hands. You cannot lead the target more if the tool you are using refuses to move when you tell it to. It would be like trying to play a piano where the keys stuck for a second before making a sound. No matter how talented the pianist, the music would always be wrong. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. It was a Tuesday. The mission had been a deep strike into industrial Germany. The 44th Bomb Group had been bounced by 3 squadrons of Luftwaffe fighters. When the planes limped back to England, the ambulance crews were already waiting on the grass. MacDonald watched as they pulled the bodies out of Heaven's Gate, a B-24 that had taken severe damage to the tail. The entire rear section was shredded by 20mm cannon fire. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Robert "Bobby" Chin, hadn't made it. Bobby was a kid from Ohio who used to share his cigarettes with MacDonald. He was 20 years old. He had excellent eyesight and steady hands. He was exactly the kind of gunner the officers said should be able to hit the target. But Bobby was dead. And the pilot, Captain Marcus Thorne, a veteran who had survived 20 missions and was looked up to by every man on the base, had been killed in the same pass. The German fighter had come right up the tail, untouched by defensive fire, and raked the fuselage from end to end. That evening, the mood in the barracks was funereal. The men were quiet, staring into their beers or writing letters they hoped wouldn't be mailed. It was in this atmosphere of defeat that Staff Sergeant David Miller found MacDonald. Miller was a tail gunner on another B-24 named Lady Luck. The name was becoming a bitter joke. Miller was a young man, barely out of high school, and his nerves were shot. He was on his 6th mission. He had fired thousands of rounds of ammunition, and had not confirmed a single kill. He had watched Bobby Chin die. He was shaking. "Mac," Miller whispered, cornering the armorer in the supply shed. "You have to do something. I can't hit them. I see them, I swear to God I see them, but the gun won't keep up. It's like dragging a plow through mud. By the time I get the bead on them, they're already firing." Miller looked at MacDonald with eyes that had seen too much too soon. "They call it a death trap, Mac. And they're right. I'm going to die in that glass bubble. I know it." MacDonald looked at the young gunner. He thought about the regulations. He thought about the engineering officer's warning. He thought about the court-martial that would surely follow if he was caught tampering with a combat aircraft. Then he thought about Bobby Chin. He thought about the quarter-inch of slack. "Bring me the flight schedule," MacDonald said quietly. "What?" "Bring me the schedule. When is Lady Luck flying next?" "Tomorrow morning. 0600. Briefing is at 0400. MacDonald nodded. "Go get some sleep, Miller. And keep your mouth shut." That night, January 22, 1944, was bitterly cold. The wind whipped across the airfield, cutting through the heavy wool of the mechanics' coats. The hangars were dark, save for the dim blue blackout lights. MacDonald made his way to the salvage yard, a graveyard of twisted metal located behind the main maintenance sheds. He wasn't looking for a spare part. He was looking for raw material. He scavenged through the wreckage of a crashed aircraft. Ironically, he found what he needed in the remains of a German fighter that had been shot down weeks earlier and hauled to the base for intelligence analysis. It was a bracket from the instrument panel of an enemy plane. The steel was high quality, German metallurgy was excellent. It was hardened, durable, and about 1/8 of an inch thick. MacDonald took the scrap metal back to his workbench. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. He worked by the focused beam of a single inspection lamp, shielding the glow with his body. He needed to fabricate a shim. A shim is a spacer, a simple piece of material used to fill a gap. His plan was dangerously simple. He was going to insert a piece of steel into the hydraulic linkage of the tail turret. This steel spacer would preload the mechanism. It would physically fill that 1/4 inch of slack. By installing this shim, the control stick would essentially be hot-wired to the valves. The moment the gunner touched the stick, the valve would open. No slack. No delay. No safety buffer. It sounded easy, but the execution required surgical precision. If the shim was too thick, the turret would drift on its own, firing uncontrollably or spinning in circles. If it was too thin, it wouldn't solve the lag. And the shape had to be perfect to fit inside the existing housing without jamming the mechanism. For 3 hours, MacDonald worked with a hand file. The sound of the metal rasping against metal was agonizingly loud in the silent hangar, or so it seemed to him. He filed, measured with calipers, and filed again. He was sweating despite the freezing temperature. He was shaping a piece of steel no larger than a matchbook, but he treated it with the care of a jeweler cutting a diamond. He angled the edges. He polished the surface so it wouldn't snag on the internal springs. At 3 o'clock, 3 hours before takeoff, MacDonald slipped out to the flight line. The B-24 Lady Luck sat heavy on its landing gear, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. The ground crew was asleep in the nearby hut. The guards were on their perimeter patrol. MacDonald climbed into the tail of the bomber. It was a tight squeeze. The smell of aluminum, canvas, and gun oil was overwhelming. He accessed the inspection panel of the hydraulic control unit. Working by feel and the tiny sliver of light from a penlight held in his teeth, he disconnected the main linkage pin. His hands were numb from the cold, making the delicate work terrifying. If he dropped the pin or the shim into the dark recesses of the fuselage, the plane would be grounded, an investigation would be launched, and he would be finished. He held his breath. He slid the custom-made shim into the gap in the linkage. It was a tight fit. He had to wiggle it, coaxing the steel into place. Then, he realigned the control rod and slid the locking pin back through. It clicked. He tightened the safety wire, ensuring the modification wouldn't vibrate loose. Then, he sat in the gunner's seat. He grabbed the control handles. The hydraulic pumps were off, so the turret wouldn't move, but he could feel the mechanical connection. It was different. Before, there was a looseness, a wiggle in the handles before you felt the resistance of the valves. Now, it was solid. Rock hard. As soon as he applied the slightest pressure, he could feel the mechanical resistance of the valve stems. The slack was gone. He closed the inspection panel, wiped away his fingerprints with a rag, and slipped out of the aircraft. He had just modified $1 million warplane with a piece of scrap metal and a hand file. He had broken every rule in the book. As he walked back to his barracks, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a crushing anxiety. What if he was wrong? What if the turret was too sensitive? What if the hydraulic pressure caused the shim to buckle and jam the controls? If David Miller died today because the guns jammed, MacDonald knew he would never forgive himself. He wouldn't need a court-martial. He would be his own executioner. The sun rose on January 23rd, a pale, watery light over the English countryside. The engines of the 44th Bomb Group roared to life, 72 massive radial engines coughing smoke and fire. MacDonald stood by the perimeter fence, watching Lady Luck taxi out. He saw David Miller in the rear turret, looking small and fragile behind the glass. MacDonald offered a silent prayer, not to God, but to the laws of physics and metallurgy. The mission was a long haul to Schweinfurt, a target deep inside Germany known for its ball-bearing factories and its ferocious defenses. The flight out was tense. The formation formed up, the bombers stacking into their protective boxes. 4 hours, there was only the drone of the engines and the crackle of the radio. Then, at 14:17, the Luftwaffe arrived. They came from high and 6 o'clock, diving out of the sun. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s, their yellow noses bright against the gray clouds. They had spotted Lady Luck, on the outer edge of the formation, a straggler. It was the classic predatory maneuver. They would slash in from the rear, hammer the tail, and vanish before the gunner could react. Inside the tail turret, Staff Sergeant David Miller saw them. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment. The terror rose in his throat, the familiar feeling of helplessness. He gripped the control handles. The lead German fighter leveled out, lining up for the kill. Miller swung the turret to the left. And then, something happened. Or rather, something didn't happen. There was no delay. There was no mush. The moment Miller's brain sent the signal to his hands, the turret snapped to the left. It was instantaneous. The heavy twin .50 calibers moved as if they were an extension of his own arms. The response was so fast it startled him. Miller didn't have to fight the controls. He didn't have to guess where the fighter would be in half a second. He simply looked at the enemy, moved his hands, and the guns were there. He squeezed the triggers. The turret vibrated violently as the heavy machine guns roared. Tracers poured out in a coherent stream. Because the turret had responded instantly, Miller's aim was true. He didn't catch the air behind the fighter, he caught the fighter itself. The round smashed into the nose of the FW-190. The canopy shattered. The engine seized and exploded in a ball of black oil and orange flame. The German fighter disintegrated, pieces of aluminum fluttering away like confetti. "Got him!" Miller screamed into the interphone, his voice cracking. "Splash one! Splash one!" But there was no time to celebrate. The second fighter was right behind the first, already committed to the attack. Seeing his wingman vaporized, the German pilot banked hard to the right, trying to break off the attack and dive away. In the old turret, Miller would have been helpless. The momentum of swinging left would have made it impossible to reverse direction fast enough to catch a fighter braking right. The hydraulic lag would have meant the guns would still be moving left while the target was moving right. But this wasn't the old turret. Miller slammed the controls to the right. The shim in the linkage did its job. The valves snapped open immediately. The hydraulic fluid reversed course instantly. The turret whipped around with a speed that defied the laws of the B-24's design. It was jarring, almost violent, but it was fast. Miller swung the bead onto the fleeing fighter. The German pilot thought he was safe. He thought he had outmaneuvered the lumbering bomber. He was wrong. Miller fired a short, controlled burst. The tracers arced through the sky and walked right into the wing root of the Messerschmitt. The wing sheared off. The plane tumbled into a flat spin and plummeted toward the earth. 2 kills. 45 seconds. The intercom on Lady Luck went silent. The crew was stunned. A tail gunner getting 2 kills in a single engagement was rare. Getting them with such precision was unheard of. But the fight wasn't over. 10 minutes later, a third fighter attempted a stern approach. This pilot was cautious, weaving back and forth, trying to throw off the gunner's aim. Miller tracked him. He felt the turret responding to every micro-adjustment of his hands. It felt surgical. He waited. He let the fighter come into range. When the German committed to his dive, Miller was already there. He fired. The third fighter began to smoke, banked sharply, and fell away, disappearing into the cloud deck below. It was later confirmed as a probable kill, and eventually upgraded to a confirmed destruction. 3 fighters. 1 mission. And Lady Luck didn't have a single bullet hole in her fuselage. When the B-24s returned to base that evening, the atmosphere was electric. The word had spread over the radio frequencies before the planes even landed. Lady Luck was back. Miller was alive. MacDonald was waiting at the hard stand. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his face a mask of calm, though his heart was racing. He watched the bomber taxi in. He saw the crew tumbling out of the hatch. David Miller didn't walk, he ran. He ran straight toward MacDonald. He looked like a man possessed. He grabbed the armorer by the shoulders, shaking him. "What did you do?" Miller shouted, but he was grinning, a wild, manic grin. "Mac, what the hell did you do to my guns?" "Keep your voice down," MacDonald hissed, looking around for officers. "It was magic," Miller whispered intensely. It was like the guns were reading my mind. No lag. No slop. I just looked, and they died. Mac, I got 3 of them. 3? The flight engineer, Sergeant Mark Benson, walked up. He was a gruff man, not easily impressed. He looked at MacDonald, then at the tail turret, then back at MacDonald. "I don't know what you did, Mac," Benson said quietly. "But I watched Miller track those bandits. That turret moved faster than anything I've ever seen on a B-24. It was twitchy, yeah, but it was fast." Benson leaned in close. "You fix mine next." "I can't," MacDonald said. "It's unauthorized. If they find out." "If they don't find out," Benson interrupted. "More of us come home. You fix mine next, or I'll tell the colonel you're holding out on us." It was a threat, but it was said with a smile. It was the blackmail of brotherhood. And so, the conspiracy began. It started with Benson's plane. Then it was the rest of the squadron. MacDonald couldn't do it all himself. There wasn't enough time in the night. So, he became a teacher. In the dark corners of the hangar, huddled under the wings of the great bombers, he taught a select group of armorers and trusted gunners how to make the shim. He showed them how to find the right scrap steel, hard enough not to deform, but workable. He showed them the template for the shape. He taught them how to file the angle just right so it wouldn't bind. He taught them the trick of installing it quickly, and more importantly, how to remove it in under 5 minutes if an official inspection team showed up. They called it the Mac shim. It wasn't a registered part number. It didn't exist on any inventory list. It was a ghost part. Within a month, over 20 B-24s in the group had been modified. The effect was statistical and undeniable. The loss rate of the 44th Bomb Group began to drop. The number of claims for enemy fighters shot down by tail gunners began to rise. The change was noticed by the enemy first. German intelligence reports from that period show a growing confusion among Luftwaffe pilots. They had a standard playbook for attacking B-24s. They knew the timing. They knew the delay. But suddenly, the American bombers were breaking the rules. The tail guns were tracking faster. The safe zone of the approach had vanished. Experienced aces who had built their scores on the sluggishness of the Liberator found themselves flying into walls of accurate fire. One captured German pilot, shot down by a modified B-24, reportedly asked his interrogators if the Americans had installed a new radar-guided fire control system. He couldn't believe that a human gunner could track his maneuver so perfectly. He was wrong about the radar, but he was right about the change. The system had changed. It had been upgraded by 3 inches of scrap metal. Back at the base, the Mac shim became an open secret among the enlisted men. The officers knew something was going on. Morale was higher, the kill counts were up, but they chose not to look too closely. In war, results often insulate you from regulations. If the planes are coming back, you don't ask why the mechanics look so tired in the mornings. However, the sheer scale of the success eventually drew the attention of the powers that be. The 8th Air Force Statistical Control Unit noticed the anomaly. The 44th was outperforming other groups with the same equipment. They sent a team to investigate. This was the moment MacDonald had feared. An engineering team from Consolidated Aircraft, accompanied by a colonel from headquarters, arrived to inspect the aircraft. They wanted to know why the tail guns on these specific planes were performing so well. They suspected the gunners had developed a new tactic. They inspected. Lady Luck? They ran the diagnostics. They found nothing. The shim had been removed prior to the inspection. But the engineers were thorough. They asked to see a live fire demonstration. They wanted to watch the turret in action on the ground. Miller was in the turret. MacDonald was standing by the wing. He hadn't had time to remove the shim from this specific test because the request had been immediate. The shim was still in there. The engineer asked Miller to swing the turret full left to full right. Miller did. The turret snapped around with violent speed. The engineer frowned. Do that again. Miller did it again. Snap. Snap. The engineer walked up to the turret. He signaled Miller to get out. He climbed in himself. He moved the stick. He felt the instant response. He felt the lack of play. He climbed out, his face pale. He walked over to the hydraulic access panel and opened it. He shined his flashlight inside. He saw the piece of non-standard steel, filed by hand, wedged into the linkage. He pulled it out. He held it up in the sunlight. The hangar went silent. MacDonald stepped forward, ready to confess, ready to be arrested. He opened his mouth to speak. But the engineer didn't call for the MPs. He looked at the shim, then he looked at the turret, and then he looked at the colonel. It's a preloader, the engineer said, his voice filled with a strange mixture of annoyance and admiration. They've eliminated the dead band in the servo valve. Is it dangerous? The colonel asked. The engineer turned the piece of scrap metal over in his hand. Technically? Yes. It bypasses the safety tolerances. It puts extra stress on the hydraulic seals. He paused. But it also makes the turret respond about 30% faster. The colonel looked at MacDonald. Did you make this, Sergeant? Yes, sir, MacDonald said, standing at attention. Did you know it was a violation of technical orders? Yes, sir. Why did you do it? MacDonald didn't talk about the mechanics. He didn't talk about the hydraulics. He looked the colonel in the eye. Because Sergeant Chin died, sir. Because they were too slow. And because Miller needed a chance. The colonel looked at the engineer. Can we authorize this? The engineer shook his head. Not as a field modification. It's too crude. If the metal fatigues and snaps, it could jam the valve open. The turret would spin out of control. MacDonald's heart sank. However, the engineer continued, pulling a notebook from his pocket. The principle is sound. The factory tolerance is too loose for combat conditions. We've been too conservative. He looked at MacDonald. You've essentially done our R&D for us, Sergeant. The outcome was not a court-martial. It was not a medal either. It was something more pragmatic. The engineering team took the Maxim back to the Consolidated Aircraft Factory in San Diego. They analyzed the geometry. They didn't use scrap metal from German fighters. They designed a new linkage arm, precision machine to reduce the slack officially. This design change was rushed into production. It was incorporated into the B-24M model, the final and most advanced version of the Liberator. The rapid response servo linkage became a standard feature. The manual was rewritten. The play was officially reduced. MacDonald never got a patent. He never got a promotion for it. In the official history books, the improvement in the B-24's defensive capabilities is attributed to continuous engineering improvements based on field data. Field data. That was the euphemism for MacDonald's sleepless nights and his stolen piece of German steel. But the men of the 44th Bomb Group didn't care about the history books. They cared about the results. For the remainder of the war, until the new factory-improved planes arrived, the Maxim remained in use. It was passed down like a sacred talisman. When a plane was damaged beyond repair, the armorers would crawl into the wreck to retrieve the shim before the plane was scrapped, transferring it to a replacement aircraft. Staff Sergeant David Miller survived the war. He completed his tour of duty and went home to marry his high school sweetheart. He had 4 children and 11 grandchildren. He died in 1998. At his funeral, his grandson told a story Miller had told him, about a magic piece of metal that made his guns move as fast as his eyes. Flight engineer Mark Benson survived. Hundreds of others survived. And while it is impossible to put an exact number on it, military historians and aviation experts who have analyzed the loss rates estimate that the increase in defensive efficiency provided by McDonald's modification likely saved between 200 and 300 American lives. That's 30 crews. 30 bombers that came home instead of spiraling into the fields of Europe. Master Sergeant Thomas McDonald returned to the United States after the war. He opened a small auto repair shop in New Jersey. He was known as a mechanic who could fix anything, a man who didn't always follow the manual but always got the engine running. He rarely spoke about the war. He certainly never bragged about outsmarting the engineers of a major aviation corporation. But those who flew with him knew. They knew that the death trap reputation of the B-24 had been broken not by a general, and not by a scientist, but by a grease-stained sergeant who refused to accept that good enough was acceptable when his friends were dying. The story of the B-24 Liberator is often overshadowed by the B-17. The Liberator was the ugly duckling. It was difficult to fly, physically demanding, and unforgiving of mistakes. But thanks to the ingenuity of men like Mac, it became a Luftwaffe killer. In the end, this story serves as a powerful reminder of a fundamental truth about warfare and innovation. We often think of technology as a top-down process, scientists in white coats inventing wonders that are handed down to the soldiers. But history shows us that often, the most critical innovations come from the bottom up. They come from the users. They come from the desperate. They come from the people who have to live with the flaws of the machine. The quarter-inch of slack in the B-24 tail turret was a flaw that cost lives. The 3-inch piece of steel that fixed it was a crime that saved them. And in the harsh calculus of war, that is the only math that matters. So, the next time you see a piece of perfectly engineered machinery, remember that it likely wasn't born perfect. It was hammered into shape by the trials of reality. And remember Thomas McDonald, the armorer who proved that sometimes, to make a thing work right, you have to break the rules. Because while the manuals are written in ink, survival is written in action. And for the crews of the Flying 8 Balls, that action was delivered by a 3-inch shim, hidden in the dark, guiding them home.